The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante Rosso's office like bullets against glass. Each drop was a sharp, clinical percussion in the symphonic storm ravaging the city tonight, a cold, violent reminder of the world he owned but refused to share. I stood exactly 3 feet from his mahogany desk, my tablet pressed against my chest like a shield, waiting for him to finish a call that had already bled 20 minutes into my scheduled briefing. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He never did. Not at first. That was the unspoken contract we'd signed 5 years ago. This careful, agonizing dance of professional distance and hidden hunger that hummed between us like a live wire, dangerous and ready to snap. Neither of us dared to reach across the gap. If Alistair thinks he can manipulate the zoning board after the ink is already dry, remind him why the shadows in this city answer to me, Dante said into the phone. His voice dropped to that dangerous register, a low, resonant rumble that made powerful men second-guess their own reflections. His authority was flawless, rolling off his tongue with a kind of sophisticated lethality that came from years of commanding an empire built on absolute loyalty and refined fear. I kept my expression neutral, a mask of frozen desire perfected over half a decade. My gaze was fixed on a point just past his left shoulder, where a piece of Renaissance art hung in perfect, museum-grade lighting. The painting was a masterpiece of shadow and light, depicting a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike, a look I had come to understand intimately. Stay with me until the final signature. Like and comment on your city below. I want to see how far the Rosso influence reaches tonight. Now, let's go. The air in the office was thick with a 5-year-old silence that was about to shatter. Around us, the Rosso empire hummed with its usual, frantic chaos, guards shifting at the perimeter, advisors whispering in the marble halls. But in this room, time felt suspended. Dante thought he was just managing another betrayal by Alistair Black. He thought he was winning a war of shadows. He thought he was finally free of the woman who knew every secret hidden in his filing cabinets. I looked at the gold embossed seal on the folder on his desk. For 5 years, I had been the invisible architect of his success, the office furniture that made his genius look so low. Dante didn't even know the address of the modest apartment I'd paid for in cash. He thought he was commanding his world from a mahogany throne. He didn't realize that tonight, the shadow he'd ignored for 5 years was the only sanctuary he had left. The storm outside was nothing compared to the nightmare that was about to walk through his door, and for the first time in 5 years, the live wire was about to be touched. The daily rhythm of the Rosso Empire was a masterclass in choreographed chaos, a machine of 1,000 moving parts that only ever appeared seamless because I was the one oiling the gears in the dark. For 5 years, my life had been measured in the distance between the elevator and Dante Rosso's desk, exactly 42 steps of polished obsidian that I traversed every morning at 6 a.m., long before the city's other titans had even opened their eyes. To the world, Dante Rosso was an unstoppable force of nature, a man of silver-haired sophistication whose controlled hunger for dominance made him appear invincible. They saw a king who moved with a predatory grace, always 3 steps ahead of his enemies and 2 steps ahead of the law. What they didn't see was the invisible architect standing 3 feet behind his shoulder. I was the one who cross-referenced the shipping manifests with the port authorities' unlisted schedules. I was the one who caught the $3 million discrepancy in the landfill merger that would have given the zoning board a reason to breathe down our necks. I was the ghost who ensured his double espresso was exactly 165 degrees, placed precisely on the mahogany coaster 2 minutes before he walked through the door. My role was to be the habit he didn't have to think about. I was the office furniture of the high towers, a living piece of the infrastructure that occasionally provided data and never, ever spoke out of turn. In the high-stakes meetings where smoke-filled rooms decided the fate of the city's skyline, I was the girl with the tablet, a neutral mask of professional distance. Dante would command the room with a dangerous register that made grown men stumble, but his authority was often a script I had helped refine. I knew every secret in his filing cabinet, the offshore accounts, the private debts of the council members, the monster hints of his own history that he kept locked away from the light. This was our careful dance, A 5-year-long performance played out in the silence of the Rosso headquarters. I had made myself essential by being invisible. I knew his moods by the way he straightened his silk tie. I knew a crisis was coming by the rhythmic tap of his heavy silver ring against the desk. And through it all, I harbored a silent, frozen desire that I buried under layers of clinical professionalism. To love a man like Dante Rosso was to love a storm. You could admire the power of the lightning, but you never, ever dared to touch the wire. As the sun began to slice through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, museum-like shadows across the Caravaggio on the wall, I felt the familiar hum of the live wire, tension between us. Dante didn't acknowledge my presence as he walked in, his gaze fixed on the city he owned. He didn't have to. I was the air he breathed, the silence he relied on, and the only reason his empire hadn't already crumbled into the sea. I stood 3 feet away, tablet pressed to my chest, an accidental hero in a world of steel and ego, waiting for the first word that would start another day of making a monster look like a god. The air at the Rosso Charity Gala was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the heavy, metallic tang of cold ambition. Beneath the soaring crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom, the city's elite moved like pieces on a chessboard, their laughter a brittle mask for the predatory calculations happening behind every flute of vintage champagne. I moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a shadow, my movements efficient and silent, carrying a physical briefing folder that felt like a live wire against my palm. Tonight, the careful dance felt different. The live wire, tension that usually hummed between Dante and me was no longer a steady vibration. It was a rhythmic, erratic pulse. Dante stood at the center of a circle of senators and shipping magnates, the absolute power anchor of the room. He wore his tuxedo like a suit of black armor, his silver-haired sophistication cutting a lethal silhouette against the gold-leafed walls. He was in his element, commanding the space with a casual authority that made the men around him look like children playing at war. I stood exactly 3 feet behind his right shoulder, a neutral extension of his will, waiting for the moment he would reach back for the data I held. But then, the atmosphere curdled. Alistair Black entered the room. He didn't just walk in. He invaded, his presence a shadow of oppression that seemed to dim the brightness of the chandeliers. He was the only man in the city who dared to look at Dante not with fear, but with a clinical, thirsty envy. As Alistair moved through the ballroom, his gaze snagged on mine for a fleeting, jagged second, a look of such staggering arrogance that it made my blood run cold. He didn't see a person. He saw a tool he intended to steal. I felt Dante's posture shift. It was a minute change, a tightening of the muscles in his back, a sharpening of the dangerous register in his voice as he transitioned from pleasantries to a low, resonant warning directed at a nearby councilman. "If the North Side permits aren't signed by midnight," Dante murmured, the sound of a predatory rumble, "Alistair won't be the only one discovering how cold the harbor is in April." Then the impossible happened. Dante didn't reach for the folder. He didn't ask for the briefing. Instead, he turned. For the first time in 5 years, the professional distance was ignored. He didn't look through me. He looked at me. His hazel eyes, usually fixed on the horizon of his next conquest, narrowed as they raked over my face, searching for a crack in the stoic mask I had perfected over half a decade. The controlled hunger I had always sensed in him was suddenly a physical weight, an intense, terrifying focus that made the tablet against my chest feel like it was made of glass. He was sensing the change in the air, the symphonic storm that Alistair Black had already set in motion. For 5 years, I had been his invisible architect, the silent furniture of his life. But in the gold-drenched light of the gala, under the looming shadow of his greatest rival, Dante Rosso looked at me as if he were seeing the fire inside the gem for the very first time. The silence between us was a vacuum that the ballroom's music couldn't fill. I kept my expression neutral, my gaze fixed on the sharp line of his tuxedo collar, but the frozen desire I had buried so deep began to thaw with a visceral, frightening speed. The game had changed. The architect was being pulled from the shadows, and as Alistair Black watched us from across the room with a look of shock and calculation, I realized that the safe, invisible life I had built for 5 years had just become the most dangerous place in the city. The symphonic storm that had been brewing at the gala finally broke at 2 a.m., not with a flourish of crystal and silk, but with the wet, heavy thud of a body hitting my front door. I had been standing in my kitchen, the habit of silence still echoing in the quiet of my modest apartment. The modest space was a stark contrast to the Rosso Towers. There were no Caravaggios here, only the soft hum of a refrigerator and the steady drumming of rain against the window pane. I was reaching for a glass of water when the sound came, a frantic, uneven scraping against the wood, followed by a weight that made the hinges groan. I didn't call the police. 5 years in the Rosso Empire had taught me that the law was a secondary concern to the controlled lethality of our world. I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel, my pulse a rhythmic, frantic percussion against my ribs, and peered through the security lens. Dante Rosso was slumped against the frame, his silver-haired sophistication shattered. I threw back the bolts, and the power anchor of the city tumbled into my living room, bringing the cold violence of the night with him. The professional boundary I had spent half a decade maintaining didn't just crack, it evaporated the moment my hands caught his shoulders. He was a wounded predator, his tailored tuxedo jacket shredded and soaked with a mixture of rainwater and a deep, spreading crimson that stained my pale rug. "Clara," he rasped, the word a broken vibration of the dangerous register I knew so well. He tried to stand, his predatory pride flaring for a fleeting second before his knees buckled. I caught him, the invisible furniture finally becoming the only thing keeping the king from the floor. The weight of him was staggering, not just the physical mass of a man built for dominance, but the sheer gravity of his presence in my private sanctuary. I dragged him toward the sofa, my breath coming in jagged hitches, my mind performing a silent, frantic audit of the first aid supplies I kept hidden for emergencies I never thought would involve him. His eyes were half closed, but as I lowered him onto the cushions, his hand shot out with a sudden, visceral speed, his fingers locking around my wrist. The live wire tension was no longer an abstract hum, it was a physical burn. Even in his weakened state, the intensity of his focus was terrifying. He looked at me, truly looked at me, in the dim, warm light of my lamp, and I saw the monster realize he was finally safe. "Alistair, the docks," he managed, his voice dropping to a register of raw, unvarnished pain. "Don't speak, Dante," I whispered, the use of his first name feeling like a betrayal of our 5-year contract, yet the only thing that made sense in the wreckage of the night. "You're in my home. He can't reach you here." I looked down at his loosened tie and the unbuttoned collar of his shirt, seeing the jagged lines of his history exposed. The shadow of oppression cast by Alistair Black had followed him to my door, but for this moment, the empire was gone. There were no capos, no shipping manifests, and no mahogany desks between us. There was only a wounded man and the woman who had loved him in silence for 5 years, finally forced to step out of the shadows to keep his soul from drifting into the abyss. As I reached for the shears to cut away his ruined jacket, I realized that the careful dance was over. The siege had begun, and the sanctuary of my home was about to become the front line of a war I was no longer just watching from the sidelines. The scent of sterile antiseptic and metallic blood filled the small, warm space of my bathroom, clashing violently with the lavender soap I usually kept on the counter. Dante sat on the edge of my porcelain tub, his frame too large for the room, his presence expanding to fill every corner of the modest apartment. I had stripped him of the ruined silk shirt, and now, the controlled hunger of the man was laid bare. His torso was a map of old violences, faded silver scars that told stories of 1,000 battles I'd only ever seen as line items in a ledger. My hands trembled as I worked. I had spent 5 years handling his schedules, his threats, and his triumphs, but I had never handled him. The skin of his shoulder was hot under my touch, a stark contrast to the rain-chilled air outside. As I cleaned the jagged graze along his ribs, the live wire, tension between us surged. This wasn't the office. There was no mahogany desk to act as a barrier, No museum-grade lighting to sanitize the reality of who he was. Here, in the dim glow of my vanity bulb, he was raw, dangerous, and overwhelmingly near. Dante didn't hiss or flinch as the alcohol stung his skin. Instead, he watched me. His gaze followed the movement of my fingers with a terrifying, predatory focus, tracking every shallow breath I took. The silver-haired sophistication was gone, replaced by the primal intensity of a man who had been stripped of his empire and left only with his instincts. I felt like a bird caught in the sights of a hawk, my frozen desire finally beginning to melt into something far more volatile. "You're efficient, Clara," he murmured, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that usually signaled a death warrant for his enemies. But here, it sounded like an invitation. "You bandage a man like you're filing a brief. Precise. Clinical. Do you ever let the mask slip?" I didn't look up, focusing on the white gauze I was taping into place. "The mask is what has kept me alive for 5 years, Mr. Rosso. It's what kept your empire running when you were too busy to notice the shadows." He laughed, a low, resonant vibration that I felt in the soles of my feet. Suddenly, his good hand reached out, his fingers catching my chin and tilting my head up until I was forced to meet his hazel eyes. The predatory pride in his expression was suffocating. I saw the monster looking back at me, but for the first time, he wasn't looking through me. He was looking inside. "I noticed the shadows, Clara," he whispered, his thumb grazing my lower lip in a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. "I noticed every breath you held, every time you looked at the Caravaggio instead of me. You thought you were invisible. You didn't realize I was just letting you think you were safe." The air in the bathroom vanished. The careful dance was over, replaced by an oppressive intimacy that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped thing. In the quiet of my home, the office furniture had been discarded. Dante Rosso was no longer a distant executive, and I was no longer a ghost. He was a predator in my parlor, and as he leaned closer, his scent of sandalwood and rain overwhelming my senses, I realized that the safety I had built for 5 years had been an illusion. He had been waiting for the storm to break, and now that the world outside was in chaos, he was finally ready to claim the one thing he had never allowed himself to touch. The rain continued to lash against the small window of my living room, but the sound had changed. It was no longer a clinical percussion, but a low, rhythmic warning. Outside, the headlights of a black sedan swept across the pavement, cutting through the dark like a predator's eyes. Alistair Black's men were circling, searching for a ghost in a city that usually bowed to the name Rosso. But inside this modest apartment, the world was reduced to the space between two heartbeats. Dante sat on my sofa, draped in a soft cashmere throw that looked absurdly out of place against his lethal silhouette. The controlled hunger that usually fueled his empire had turned inward, focused entirely on the woman who had spent 5 years making him look invincible. We were hidden in plain sight, two shadows in a room filled with the quiet scent of lavender and the fading tang of iron. "You knew about the offshore accounts in the Caymans," Dante murmured, his voice dropping to that dangerous register, though now it lacked its edge of iron. It was a low, resonant vibration that felt like a secret shared in the dark. "And you knew I was the one who authorized the hit on the shipyard union leader back in my 3rd year." I sat on the floor by his feet, my back against the fabric of the sofa, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. "I knew because I was the one who scrubbed the digital trail, Dante. I was the one who made sure the authorities looked at the union's internal squabbles instead of the man in the silver-haired suit." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of 5 years of unacknowledged partnership. For half a decade, we had been a machine of absolute loyalty and professional distance, but tonight, the careful dance had led us here. "Why stay?" he asked, and for the first time, the power anchor sounded human. "A woman with your intellect. You could have run a firm of your own. You could have been the sun, not the shadow." I felt the frozen desire in my chest start to burn, a visceral heat that I could no longer suppress. I turned my head slightly, looking at the sharp line of his jaw in the dim lamplight. "Because the sun is lonely, Dante. And because I realized a long time ago that you were the only monster in this city worth protecting." He reached out, his hand sliding into my hair with a slow, possessive grace that made the live wire, tension between us, snap. He didn't pull me closer. He simply held me there, his thumb grazing the shell of my ear. The oppressive intimacy of the moment was more staggering than any threat from Alistair Black. "You think you're a shadow, Clara," he whispered, leaning down until his breath was a warm ghost against my neck. "But I've spent 5 years watching you. I knew the exact moment you started drinking your coffee black, because you didn't have time to wait for the milk. I knew the way you'd straighten your skirt before. A board meeting when you were nervous. You weren't invisible. You were the only thing in my life that felt real." The confession was a physical blow, a nightmare of exposure that felt like the ultimate relief. The secrets we had kept, his violences and my longings, were finally out in the light. Outside, the storm raged, and the shadow of oppression continued to circle, but in the quiet of my home, the invisible furniture had finally been claimed. We were two predators in a sanctuary of our own making, waiting for the dawn to break, so we could finally set the world on fire. Dante's grip tightened, his predatory pride returning with a renewed, terrifying intensity, and I knew that whenever we stepped back into the light, the Rosso Empire would never be the same. By morning, the fever had broken, leaving Dante not weakened, but refined into something sharper and more lethal. The wounded predator had transitioned back into the man of controlled hunger, though the clinical executive mask remained discarded on my living room floor along with his ruined tuxedo. He moved through my small kitchen with a silent, prowling grace that made the walls feel as if they were closing in, his presence expanding until there was no air left that didn't belong to him. I was standing by the counter, my back to the room as I reached for a ceramic mug, trying to anchor myself in the mundane habit of silence that had been my only protection for 5 years. But the rhythm of the apartment had changed. The steady percussion of the rain had slowed to a rhythmic drip, and the live wire tension was no longer a hum, it was a roar. I felt him before I heard him. The heat of his body radiated against my back, a physical weight that made my breath hitch in my throat. I tried to turn, to regain some semblance of the professional distance that kept me safe, but Dante was faster. He braced his hands on the marble counter on either side of me, pinning me into the small curve of the kitchen nook. I was cornered in my own sanctuary. "The mask is slipping, Clara," he whispered, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that vibrated through my spine. He didn't touch me, yet the proximity was an oppressive intimacy that made my knees weak. "You've spent 5 years perfecting that neutral gaze, staring at Caravaggios and mahogany desks as if you were made of stone. But here, in the light of your own home, you're bleeding truth." I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, my frozen desire finally shattering under the heat of his focus. "I did what was necessary for the Rosso Empire, Dante. I was the furniture you needed me to be. Furniture doesn't watch a man's reflection in the glass for 3 minutes after he leaves the room," he countered, his breath a warm, possessive ghost against the shell of my ear. He leaned in closer, his silver-haired sophistication roughened by a night of survival, his eyes gleaming with a predatory pride that was terrifying in its absolute certainty. "Furniture doesn't memorize the scent of a man's cologne until it can find him in a crowded ballroom with its eyes closed." He shifted, his chest brushing against my shoulder, a deliberate strike against the 5-year-old boundary. I finally looked up, trapped between his arms, and saw the monster in full bloom. There was no shock or calculation in his eyes, only the intense, terrifying focus of a man who had finally stopped playing the game. "You think you're a secret, Clara? You think I ignored you because I didn't see the way your pulse jumps when I step too close." He laughed, a low, resonant rumble of pure power. "I didn't ignore you. I was waiting. I was building an empire big enough to house a woman like you. I wanted to see how long you could hold that silence before it burned you alive." He reached out then, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw with a slow, claiming grace that made the world outside my window vanish. Alistair Black, the shadow of oppression, the city, the coup, it all felt like ash compared to the fire Dante was finally allowed to stoke. "The silence is over," he whispered, his face inches from mine, his voice a promise of controlled lethality, turned into a vow. "You aren't my assistant anymore, and you aren't a shadow. You're the only thing in this city I actually care to own. I've known you loved me since the 3rd month of the 1st year, Clara. And I've been counting the seconds until I could hear you say it while I had you cornered like this." The nightmare discovery wasn't that he was a monster, but that he was a monster who had been watching me back with the same desperate hunger. I looked into his hazel eyes and realized that the careful dance had never been a dance at all. It was a hunt. And as his hand slid into my hair to tilt my head back, I knew that the invisible furniture had finally been claimed by the king. The silence of the kitchen was shattered not by words, but by the sharp, rhythmic crack of wood splintering in the hallway. The symphonic storm outside had finally breached the perimeter of my sanctuary. The headlights that had been circling like hungry eyes were now replaced by the heavy, tactical thud of boots against the floorboards. Alistair Black's shadow of oppression had found us, and the modest apartment I'd paid for in cash was about to become a tomb. Dante didn't flinch. The predatory pride that had been focused on me shifted instantly back to the lethal, controlled hunger of the boss. He moved with a speed that defied his recent injuries, his hand sliding from my jaw to the small of my back, guiding me toward the floor as the first pane of glass exploded inward. "Stay low, Clara," he commanded, his voice a low, resonant rumble that cut through the chaos. "And don't look back." But for 5 years, I had made a career out of looking where others were too afraid to see. I wasn't just office furniture anymore. I was the only person who knew the layout of this building, the narrow maintenance hatch behind the laundry closet, and the fact that Alistair's men were likely expecting a wounded man, not a coordinated defense. As a shadow loomed in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted by the flickering street lamp, I didn't scream. My habit of silence turned into a tactical advantage. While Dante engaged the first man with a visceral, jagged efficiency, I reached into the utility drawer, the one where I kept the heavy iron kitchen shears and the high-intensity tactical flashlight I'd bought after the shipyard union strike. The room was a blur of violence and oppressive intimacy. Dante was a whirlwind of silver-haired lethality, but he was still bleeding, his movements hampered by the graze on his ribs. When a second attacker raised a silenced pistol, targeting Dante's exposed flank, the invisible assistant finally stepped into the light. I didn't think, I moved. I slammed the heavy iron shears into the attacker's wrist and triggered the strobe on the flashlight, blinding the room in a jagged, staccato glare. The moment of shock and calculation on the gunman's face was the only opening Dante needed. He finished the man with a clinical finality, his breathing heavy but his focus absolute. He turned to me, his eyes raking over my disheveled form, a look of fierce, terrifying approval crossing his face. "The laundry closet," I breathed, my voice trembling but certain. "There's a service ladder to the alley. If we move now, we can be at the north side safe house before Alistair even realizes he's lost his lead." Dante grabbed my hand, his grip a physical claim that tethered me to the storm. "I told you, Clara," he rasped as we navigated the darkening hallway, stepping over the wreckage of my quiet life. "You were never just a shadow. You are the only one in this city brave enough to stand in the dark with a monster." We burst through the maintenance hatch into the freezing rain, the symphony of the storm swallowing the sounds of the pursuit. I was the accidental hero of the Rosso Empire, the woman who had traded her sanctuary for a war, but as we disappeared into the shadows of the alley, I realized I hadn't lost my home. I had simply moved the furniture. The siege was far from over, but as Dante pulled me into the darkness of a waiting vehicle, his predatory pride burning brighter than the city lights, I knew that Alistair Black had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten that every king needs an architect, and the architect of the Rosso Empire was no longer working in silence. The safe house on the north side was a fortress of glass and cold, reinforced steel, overlooking a city that still believed its king was dead. Inside, the symphonic storm had settled into a low, vibrating hum of tactical preparation. Dante stood at the center of the room, his silver-haired sophistication partially restored by a fresh black shirt, though he refused to button the collar. The controlled hunger in his eyes was no longer directed at me. It was focused on the digital map of the city glowing on the wall, a grid of Alistair Black's newly seized territories that I was currently dismantling, one line of code at a time. For 5 years, I had built the Rosso Empire from the shadows, and tonight, I was the one who knew exactly where the load-bearing pillars were hidden. Alistair Black had assumed that seizing the physical assets, the docks, the warehouses, the armored cars, was enough to claim the throne. He had forgotten that an empire in the 21st century is built on data, unlisted shell companies, and the silent loyalty of the men who actually move the freight. The zoning board just received the leaked transcripts of Alistair's private meetings with the Union rebels. I murmured, my fingers flying across the tablet with a visceral, jagged efficiency. By dawn, his legal shield will be non-existent. And I've just rerouted the encryption keys for his offshore holdings in the Caymans. He's ruling a kingdom with a bankrupt treasury, Dante. Dante moved behind me, his presence a warm, physical weight that grounded me in the high-stakes chaos. He rested a hand on the back of my chair, his thumb grazing the nape of my neck in a gesture of predatory pride that made the live wire, tension between us spark once more. He wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at the way my mind worked, his hazel eyes gleaming with a terrifying, fierce approval. "You're a monster of a different kind, Clara," he whispered, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made the air in the room feel electric. Alistair thought he was fighting a dragon. He didn't realize he was being hunted by the person who designed the labyrinth. The counterstrike was clinical and absolute. While Alistair's men were still celebrating their hollow victory in the Rosso Towers, Dante's loyalist capos, men who answered only to the codes I provided, began the physical reclamation. We watched the feeds in silence as warehouse after warehouse fell back into the Rosso fold. Alistair's shadow of oppression was being systematically burned away by the very infrastructure he thought he had conquered. By 4 a.m., the symphony of the storm had reached its climax. Alistair Black was cornered in his own penthouse, his assets frozen, his allies vanishing into the night like ghosts. He had tried to treat the Rosso Empire like a transaction, a piece of furniture to be moved. He hadn't realized that the empire had a soul, and that soul was currently sitting 3 feet away from the man who commanded it. "It's done," I said, finally setting the tablet down on the cold steel table. The habit of silence was gone, replaced by a weary, triumphant calm. The Rosso name is the only one left standing. Dante turned me around in the chair, his grip on my waist a physical claim that finally ended the 5-year-long careful dance. He looked at me with an intensity that surpassed any executive authority, his controlled hunger finally finding its true north. The war for the city was won, but the real transformation was just beginning. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, the smell of expensive tobacco and cold rain surrounding us both. "Tonight, we didn't just reclaim a throne, Clara," he whispered, his voice a vow of controlled lethality and absolute possession. "We built a new one. And you're never going back to the shadows again." The invisible architect had successfully dismantled a rival empire in a single, lethal night, but as Dante's lips finally met mine, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the city we had saved. It was the fact that the monster had finally found his queen, and the silence of the last 5 years was finally, beautifully broken. 6 months later, the rain no longer sounded like bullets. As I stood in the marble rotunda of the Rosso estate, the late afternoon sun bled through the arched windows, casting a warm, honeyed glow over a room that had once felt like a beautiful cage. The air was thick with the scent of white roses and expensive incense, a soft, fragrant counterpoint to the cold, metallic tang of the empire we had reclaimed together. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, and for the first time in over half a decade, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. The invisible furniture was gone. In her place stood a queen draped in silk the color of moonlight, her habit of silence finally shed like an old, constricting skin. My posture was no longer a neutral mask of professional distance. It was a testament to earned calm, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a woman who had stood in the fire with a monster and emerged with her own flame. The doors to the grand hall opened not with a heavy thud, but with a graceful, resonant vibration. I didn't wait for a cue. I didn't stand 3 feet behind anyone. I walked down the aisle with a fierce, quiet confidence that made the gathered elite of the city, the very men who had once looked through me, hold their collective breath. They saw the Rosso influence in the way I moved, the strategic mind of the architect now fully visible in the predator's gaze. Dante stood at the altar, the absolute power anchor of my world. He wore a tuxedo of obsidian black, his silver-haired sophistication a sharp, lethal contrast to the softness of the flowers surrounding him. As I reached him, he didn't give me a clinical nod or a distant briefing. He reached out, his hand locking with mine in a physical claim that was both a celebration and a vow. The live wire, tension was still there, hummed between us as intensely as ever, but it no longer threatened to snap. It was the current that powered our shared throne. "You're late, Clara," he whispered as I stepped up beside him, his voice dropping to that dangerous register. But this time, it was laced with a predatory pride that was entirely for me. I was beginning to think the architect had decided to redesign the ceremony. "The architect was just ensuring the foundations were perfect, Dante," I countered, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence of the hall. "A queen doesn't rush." The ceremony was a masterpiece of controlled lethality and profound intimacy. We didn't just exchange rings. We exchanged a legacy. 6 months ago, I had been a shadow in his office, hiding a frozen desire beneath a digital tablet. Today, I was the one who held the encryption keys to his heart and his empire. As the priest spoke of unions and blood pacts, I looked out at the guests, at the loyalists who had fought for us and the rivals who now bowed to the name Rosso. I saw the city we had dismantled and rebuilt, a world that was no longer a nightmare to be feared, but a kingdom to be ruled. When Dante finally leaned in to seal the vow, the kiss was a visceral, claiming celebration. It was the end of the careful dance and the beginning of a reign. As we turned to face the room, walking out of the hall hand in hand, I realized that the symphonic storm had finally passed. The monster had found his soul, and the invisible assistant had found her voice. I was no longer standing in the shadows of the Rosso Empire. I was the one who owned the light. The narrative distinguishes between position power, Dante's title as boss, and expert/information power, Clara's mastery of the empire's infrastructure. It teaches that in any organization, the most invisible person is often the one holding the structural integrity together. When the architect steps out of the shadows, the true hierarchy is revealed. Clara's habit of silence is a study in strategic emotional intelligence. By maintaining a neutral mask, she observes patterns that others miss. It demonstrates the value of active listening and observation. Her 5 years of silence were not passive, but a long-term data collection phase that allowed her to dismantle a rival empire in a single night. Alistair Black serves as a cautionary tale of transactional leadership. He assumes that power is merely the possession of physical assets, money, buildings, ships. The story teaches that true leadership is built on social capital, the deep, unlisted loyalties and human connections that Alistair ignored, leading to his bankruptcy and ultimate defeat. Clara's arc is a journey towards self-actualization. For 5 years, she defined herself through Dante's success enmeshment. Her transformation occurs when she realizes she is his equal, not his shadow. It teaches that professional worth is not something given by a superior, but something recognized and claimed by the individual. The story highlights the isolation of high-status leadership. Dante owns the city, but realizes that his empire is a beautiful cage, without a trusted partner. It underscores the educational concept of psychological safety, the idea that even the most powerful leaders require a sanctuary where they can be vulnerable, or their controlled lethality eventually turns inward and destroys them. The narrative functions as a study in strategic partnership. It proves that a monster A dominant leader is only as effective as the architect, the strategic advisor beside them, and that the most durable empires are those where power is shared between the visible head and the invisible heart.